Good morning, NSFers. I am very glad you could be with us today. This is our second panel discussion in our series on the war in Ukraine. We started this series with initiating talk given by Dmitry Gorenberg from CNA, Center for Naval Analysis, just a few days before the war started. And our first panel discussion was on the issues of nuclear security with the nuclear reactors and nuclear U.S. use policy, nuclear weapons U.S. policy, with Anna Fink and our own Keith Hansen. So both of those programs are already available and posted on our website. Please feel free to go on and check those out. Scroll to the bottom of our landing page where our videos are. We will also be continuing this series given the gravity of the issues on the war in Ukraine. So our next program after this will be on the 14th of April with Dr. Tom Fingar from Stanford University, talking about the relationship between Russia and China and how that affects not only Ukraine, but potentially issues in Taiwan as well. I am also in the process of scheduling programs on food security issues related to the war, cybersecurity issues related to the war. So stay tuned that we will get those announcements out to you as quickly as possible. And those program announcements will be going out probably by the end of this week. We're also putting together a resource page. I haven't got that up yet, but I do hope to have it up by early next week with all sorts of resources from our talks and related topics that you can stay attuned of the complicated issues in Ukraine. So with that, I welcome our speakers today. Professor Gregory Koblentz from George Mason University will be giving the keynote talk on the issues of chem bio weapons and chem bio facilities in Ukraine. And he will be followed by our own Mike Matthews, who many of you know. He's from the Protective Security Advisor to Nevada for DHS CISA, and he'll be talking about the implications for the homeland on these issues. With that, let's get started, and I'll turn it over to our speaker. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to be talking about the role of chemical and biological weapons in the war in Ukraine, and so far these have been major issues that have been the subject of lots of allegations and accusations and threats and warnings, and so I'm going to try and kind of straighten this out and provide some background and context for both kind of the current round of allegations and accusations, and then a little bit about the history to understand, why these weapons are kind of featuring the conflict the way they are, and what we can expect moving forward. Start off with a bit of a primer about what chemical and biological weapons are, just in case any of the members of the group here are not familiar with them. And then discuss the current role in the conflict in terms of the allegations around the so-called biolabs in Ukraine, the possibility of there being a false flag incident staged by Russia, and then providing, again, that kind of history for Russia's chemical and biological weapons programs, which could play a role if and when Russia decides to use these weapons in some way, and then come back to the Russian disinformation, which is related to the allegations. But again, there's a long history here, and there's, I think, some useful context to understand why Russia is making some of these allegations the way they are. So just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what chemical and biological weapons are. Chemical weapons are toxic chemicals that can cause death, temporary incapacitation, or permanent harm to humans or animals. And this is the working definition that the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons uses. Examples of chemical warfare agents include sulfur mustard, sarin, and VX. Biological weapons are pathogenic microorganisms that can cause death or disease in humans, plants, or animals. And these can be bacteria, fungi, viruses, and the classic examples include things like anthrax, tularemia, and smallpox. And finally, there's a category of toxins, which actually are covered by both the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention, because they kind of straddle the two worlds of chemical and biological weapons, because these are toxic chemicals that can either be produced synthetically and be man-made chemicals, or can be produced by living organisms, whether they're bacteria or animals. So even though technically I should be talking about chemical, biological, and toxin weapons, we'll be just talking about chemical and biological weapons, since those are the main areas that have been discussed in the context of the Ukraine war. Just want to highlight a couple of similarities between chemical and biological weapons. And this is, I think, contributes to why these weapons are usually talked about in the same context, and many times are abbreviated to be CBW or ChemBio. And so, there are some similarities between these weapon types, that the fact that they both rely on dual use equipment, materials, and technologies that have peaceful civilian applications, but could be misused to produce actual chemical weapons or biological weapons. And this is a key feature of these weapons that makes it harder to have verification of arms control agreements and harder to collect intelligence on them. And as we'll see, contributes to some of the ambiguity that Russia is able to exploit in terms of making allegations about what US and Ukraine are doing. Chemical and biological weapons are also pretty much unique in that they affect only living things, right? They are not kinetic weapons that can blow stuff up, right? They can only kill or harm humans, plants and animals. And so that's a kind of a special feature of these weapons that's worth keeping in mind. There's also a wide variety of different types of chemical and biological agents that can cause effects from the highly lethal to incapacitation or just temporary disabling and irritation. And these effects can either be very short-lived, or they can linger for days or even weeks, depending on the particular agent. So there's a wide spectrum of effects that different chemical and biological weapons can have. The effects of these weapons are highly dependent on atmospheric and environmental conditions, because the primary way for disseminating these weapons is through aerosol clouds that are very much dependent on the direction of the wind and wind speed and other environmental conditions. And this is especially true for biological weapons, because again, these are living organisms that are very fragile, and they don't like UV radiation. They don't like extremely high humidity, extremely low humidity. And so the environmental conditions are a big impact on the effects of a biological weapons attack. And likewise do also have a role in chemical weapons, but not quite as significant. These weapons are also very versatile in the sense that they can be delivered lots of different ways, ranging from very small munitions used by special forces or clandestine agents, all the way up to long-range ballistic missiles or cruise missiles that have chemical or biological payloads, and everything in between: artillery, bombs, rockets, other types of delivery systems. So there's a wide variety here. The one piece of good news is that there are treatments available for some of these agents, especially for the nerve agents. We have things like atropine. For biological agents, in some cases we have antibiotics. In other cases we have antiviral drugs. And for some of the biological warfare agents, we even have vaccines that can protect troops and civilians before they're even exposed or infected by a biological agent. And that's one of the unique characteristics of biological weapons, is that you can actually protect your population ahead of time using vaccines. But this also puts a premium on being able to detect these weapons, the use of these weapons early on, in order to get the right treatments into the field and to actually provide them, administer them to the civilians or military forces who've been targeted. Another final common feature of these weapons is that they have long been viewed as barbaric weapons. There's a longstanding taboo against the use of disease and poison in warfare. And in modern times, it's manifested itself in the 1925 Geneva Protocol, the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, and the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention, which all prohibit the development and use of these weapons. But this is a taboo that goes back, centuries, and it's cross-cultural. So there's a very strongly kind of innate human sense of revulsion at using chemical and biological weapons. And so this is one of the reasons why the use of these weapons has been so rare, and one of the reasons why we have these very comprehensive treaties banning their development and use, because of this general taboo against these weapons. Of course, doesn't mean that they're not used, as we've seen in the case of Syria, used quite widely. Russia has obviously shown its willingness to also use Novichok nerve agents for assassination purposes, but these are the exceptions, not the rule. Now, there are very important differences between chemical and biological weapons, and this is one of the reasons why I caution against lumping these weapons together as a chem bio threat or a CBW threat. And I will make those references just because it's easier, but even when I do so, it's important to keep in mind that there are very important kind of physical, material differences between how these weapons operate, and that is important for understanding and calibrating the threat when we are hearing about potential Russian use or Russian threats or allegations going on in the context of Ukraine. I mean, most fundamentally, very important difference, right? Again, is that chemical weapons are based on, chemical molecules that are not alive, they don't replicate in any way, whereas biological weapons are based on these living organisms that can replicate inside a host. They can spread from human to human as well if they're a contagious agent. And so there's just this fundamental difference between the nature of these the properties. And one of the things this means is that chemical weapons are much more kind of stable, persistent, whereas biological warfare agents are much more fragile and are not usually found persisting in the environment for as long. These weapons are also delivered in slightly different ways. Chemical weapons are usually in liquid form. The idea of mustard gas is a misnomer, right? These are almost always liquid forms of chemical warfare agents that are either dispensed as a liquid or as the vapor coming off from evaporation. Whereas for biological weapons, the goal is to create an aerosol cloud of microscopic droplets of just the right size that they can be inhaled into the human lungs, where the effects of an infection are much more severe than the other routes of infection. And in part because of that, these aerosol clouds, because they can, if they're the right size, they can basically behave like a gas, and they can float for long distances in the environment. And so it gives the potential for biological weapons to cover very large areas, upwards of hundreds or even thousands of square kilometers if they are very well done and very, very sophisticated. Chemical weapons, again, because they are typically dispensed in this liquid form, then a much smaller radius of contamination, but can still do up to tens of square kilometers, right, if you have a large enough payload on a munition. Chemical weapons do the advantage of having very rapid action, up to seconds in the event of nerve agents, but other types of chemical warfare agents, such as sulfur mustard, right, might take hours to come into effect. But again, relatively rapid effects are seen. Whereas for biological weapons, they have much longer incubation periods because it takes time for the pathogen that has infected the host to replicate to an extent in which the host still starts exhibiting symptoms. And so that can be a period of days to weeks. And this is one of the features that makes biological weapons use harder to attribute and determine the origin, because in the event of attack, right, you won't even detect that an attack has happened for days or weeks afterwards. It makes it much harder to trace back and understand where this outbreak started from and where it came from. Chemical weapons are most of them, if not, most of them are able to penetrate the skin, right? So the nerve agents, sulfur mustard. And so it's necessary for soldiers to wear full body protective suits in order to protect themselves. And these suits are very hot and heavy and uncomfortable and unwieldy. And this actually is one of the big reasons why militaries don't like chemical weapons. Because if you're going to use these weapons on the battlefield against your enemy, right, you need to suit up your troops in order to prevent them from getting blowback or for them to be able to operate in contaminated terrain. And that is going to slow down your forces, and it's just logistically and operationally more complicated. So for most modern militaries, right, they would just as soon not be using chemical weapons because it will force them to take defensive precautions, make their lives harder. For biological weapons, right, if the major threat is an aerosol, right, you really only need to prevent inhalation of the threat agents. You really need respiratory protection. So, face masks and gas masks that we've all become all too familiar with during the pandemic are pretty effective here. The real problem here is knowing when to put on this kind of respiratory protection is hard, because these aerosol clouds typically are invisible to human senses, and we do not have real-time biodetection capabilities that can tell us when there is a biological aerosol cloud, that's being used as a weapon. The sensors that we do have for biological weapons are they do exist, but there's always trade-offs between how accurate they are, how fast they are, how portable they are, and how reliable they are. Because this is still very much cutting edge technology, whereas detection of chemical warfare agents is much more straightforward, and it can be done very quickly and reliably in the field by people with minimal training. And then again, just to reiterate, the availability of medical countermeasures varies here. There's no such thing as a vaccine against chemical weapons, but there are many treatments that are available that are effective soon after symptoms arise. And obviously the symptoms of a chemical attack are much more obvious. So it's easy to administer the antidotes if you have them on hand. For biological weapons, depending on the agent, right? Sometimes there's both a antibiotic or antiviral available as well as a vaccine. In other cases, you just have one or the other, but there are defenses that you can deploy. And again, this puts a premium on detecting an attack early on, so you know to deploy the appropriate medical countermeasures to the affected population in order to mitigate the consequences. So this is just kind of setting the scene for what chemical and biological weapons are and what they aren't, in order to kind of, again, put the Russian allegations in the Ukraine context a little bit more, some more background. So to start off with the major focus of the Russian allegations here have really centered around biological weapons. We'll talk about the chemical stuff, but the Russians have given their highest profile and priority to spreading disinformation about biological weapons in Ukraine. And the centerpiece of this revolves around 35 or so public health and veterinary diagnostic labs in Ukraine that have received assistance over the years from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which is part of the Department of Defense. And DITRA has been working in not just Ukraine, but in other former Soviet republics and even other countries in the Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia, to do two things. One is to help them build up their biosurveillance capabilities and help them detect disease outbreaks more quickly, and to do so safely and securely. So upgrading these facilities in terms of abilities to operate in terms of biosafety and biosecurity standards, and giving them the kinds of equipment and training they need in order to do this kind of surveillance. And once they detect an outbreak, right, respond to it and be able to store these pathogens, safely and in a way that they can't then be, stolen by terrorists or criminals or anything like that. And this is a long-standing program that DITRA has been doing in Ukraine since about 2005. There's been a little bit of confusion because this program, which is also known as the Biological Threat Reduction Program, initially started in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, basically disarming Russian nuclear, biological, chemical weapons facilities and employing weapons scientists in peaceful activities. That kind of weapons-oriented part of that program kind of stopped about 10 years ago or so. And since then, it's been expanded the scope and is much more focused on these more kind of public health mission in the former Soviet republics and in other countries. So just because a facility is working with DITRA and is part of this biological threat reduction program doesn't mean it ever had any role in a weapons program in any way. And as far as we know, there were no Ukrainian facilities that were part of the Soviet offensive VW program. All those facilities were in Russia, still are in Russia. So these are really just legitimate civilian scientific public health and veterinary diagnostic labs. But right, this has not prevented the Russians from raising all sorts of suspicions and allegations about what these labs are up to. They've helpfully provided lots of documentation that is actually all unclassified and open source about their different allegations. And I won't go into details, just to highlight a couple things. So they've made a lot of try to impute nefarious intentions to research on avian influenza and the role of migratory birds in spreading avian influenza, which is actually a well-known vector for this disease to spread from Asia to Europe. They've raised suspicions about Ukrainian research on Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, which, as its name implies, actually was discovered in Crimea in 1944. So this is a disease endemic to Ukraine, right? And frankly, right, everyone should be surprised if Ukraine wasn't doing research on this virus, because it actually is a public health threat in their country. And there's other research being done on bats as disease vectors, which again is a problem that is well known in public health, and this zoonotic spillover risk is real, and this is a problem in Ukraine. And finally, the Russians have also raised questions about why would scientists want to take blood from ethnic Russians in Ukraine or from Ukrainians and take them back to labs in Germany and the United States to study. Well, that's what you do to understand seroprevalence and to understand to what extent people have been exposed to certain types of diseases just naturally occurring, and to understand the prevalence rate of disease by seeing who has antibodies to different types of diseases. And so that's a very common public health research tool. And it's not at all suspicious. And the fact that these people happen to be ethnic Russian or Slavic is because this is Ukraine, and that's just the ethnicity of the people who live there. It's not that they're being used to single out a particular ethnic group for this kind of research at all. And another kind of thing to keep in mind is that the Russian allegations are trying to state that there's a top secret U.S. bioweapons program in Ukraine. The irony is they're using scientific presentations at international conferences. They're using peer-reviewed journal articles as evidence of this top secret program, which is logically just doesn't make any sense. And a lot of the Russian allegations are just kind of technically ridiculous as well. So these allegations are completely unfounded, and yet the Russians have made this a big centerpiece of their propaganda. And unfortunately, China has also been echoing them on this, and they have also found outlets in the United States that are repeating these allegations as well. And in fact, the most recent set of Russian allegations, which came out about a week ago, really are kind of beyond the pale and really are just so outrageously outlandish that we should just be laughing at them about this. This is a slide from a presentation at the Ministry of Defense, and you can ignore the Cyrillic writing, but you can obviously see logos for DoD and for DITRA and for State Department and USAID and some US companies, And over here, there's pictures of Hunter Biden and George Soros, who, according to Russia, are managing and investing and financing this secret US bioweapons program in Ukraine, which is utterly ridiculous. There's actually just a piece in the Washington Post today, a fact-checking piece that debunked, the role of Hunter Biden in any of this. This is clearly an example of, Russia merging their conspiracy theories about US bioweapons with lots of kind of existing right-wing conspiracy theories about Hunter Biden, George Soros, and throw in, a good dose of anti-Semitism. So these Russian allegations, again, just scientifically, politically, on every level, are just kind of outrageous. But unfortunately, they are getting traction in certain quarters, which is disturbing. One of the kind of more serious aspects of the Russian allegations is the concern that Russia is making these allegations and warning that Ukraine and the US might use bioweapons or chemical weapons, against Russia. The Russians are saying this as a prelude for them staging their own false flag incident, that Russia would either use a chemical or biological agent in Ukraine or pretend to use one or stage what looks like a chemical or biological attack in Ukraine, perhaps in one of the occupied territories like Donbass or Luhansk, and then use it as justification for Russia to then use its own chemical and biological weapons. And the idea of using, staging a false flag, is not new. In fact, this is a staple in Russian propaganda for many years in Syria, where Russia will constantly accuse the Syrian rebels of, using chemical weapons against themselves in order to, provoke, U.S. or Western military intervention, and trying to distract attention from the fact that it's the Assad regime in Syria that's been using chemical weapons consistently throughout the conflict and trying to kind of muddy the waters there. But the fact that the same, countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, that were warning about the invasion of Ukraine before the invasion happened, these are the same countries warning about a potential false flag, I think means that we have to take this potential quite seriously. The good news is that publicizing that Russia might be planning a false flag is a good way to kind of take power away from that, because if Russia announces suddenly that there's been some kind of chemical or biological attack, and they want to blame the Americans or blame the Ukrainians. To me, a lot harder when everyone has kind of been primed to expect Russia to make those kinds of allegations, and presumably will be subject to much higher level of scrutiny. The other kind of good news is that the U.S. and others have stopped warning about this of late. These are kind of, this peaked about 2 weeks ago and has not been really talked about very much since then. So it's quite possible that publicizing these plots and plans have led them to being abandoned. However, there have been other incidents which do still kind of continue to raise concerns. One of them, it happened in the town of Sumy, Ukraine, where actually in about a week ago or so, the Russian government started issuing warnings that Ukraine was planning a false flag episode, and they specifically mentioned a chemical facility in this town of Sumy, and specifically mentioned the use of ammonia as the agent that was going to be used. And a couple of days later, Russian artillery hit this chemical plant and actually did breach an ammonia storage tank and release some amount of ammonia, which is a toxic industrial chemical. It's lighter than air, so it's not kind of a persistent chemical threat, but it is nasty stuff. Based on the public reporting I've seen, that there were not any or that many casualties and no deaths, I don't think, were reported here. And it does raise the question of, was this intended as a act of chemical sabotage by the Russians, or was this just collateral damage? Because Russia has made it a point to attack Ukrainian industrial sites and defense industrial sites as a way of reducing Ukrainian capabilities. And so this might just happen to have been the turn for this plant to be attacked, and they're just trying to kind of reduce Ukrainian industrial capacity overall. They weren't really trying to release a large toxic cloud to cause lots of casualties. A bit unclear about what was going on here, but this also just highlights the fact that Ukraine is a very pretty highly industrialized country. There are lots of toxic industrial chemicals in that country, and given the indiscriminate nature of Russian military actions there, right, not surprising these kind of facilities would come under attack, the same way that we saw Ukrainian nuclear power plants taking damage as well. And so we should expect to see other episodes like this, where you have chemical facilities that are being attacked and potentially posing danger to local communities. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. Now, one of the real ironies of this is that Russia is accusing Ukraine of wanting to use chemical weapons against it. And in fact, it's Russia that has a legacy of developing and using chemical weapons, right? Ukraine does not. And so I just want to kind of quickly review a bit of the history of the Soviet chemical weapons program, because this is a program that Russia inherited with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Russia was actually the biggest victim of chemical warfare during World War I. They took something like 50,000 deaths caused by chemical weapons on the Eastern Front during the war. They just were totally unprepared to defend themselves against chemical weapons. And partly as a result of that, they overcompensated in the interwar period, and they built up a massive chemical weapons industry in order to not be vulnerable the way they were in World War I. After World War II, they managed to get their hands on some of the German scientists who developed nerve agents and brought them back to the Soviet Union to develop their own versions of sarin and so on, and then later also VX. And so, Russia, Soviet Union during the Cold War period, again, had a very large chemical weapons program. And again, it was based on this historical legacy of what happened in World War I, and then the surprise of the German development of nerve agents in World War II that were not detected till pretty much the war was over, and obviously part of the superpower arms race that was occurring throughout the Cold War. The Soviets, however, were not satisfied with VX and similarly lethal nerve agents, and so they launched a program in the early 1970s and late 1960s called Foliant, which was designed to produce a new generation of even more toxic chemical weapons, and ideally chemicals that would not be detected by traditional detection systems, and would also not be subject to the chemical weapons arms control verification regime that was being developed at the time. And they actually succeeded in this with a family of chemicals called Novichok, which is Russian for newcomer. And they actually discovered, hundreds of very toxic compounds that were used chemical precursors that were not standard weapons precursors, and so were not covered by the treaty regime that was being developed at the time. So there are, we think, about 5 Novichok agents that were actually developed by the Soviets and then by Russia. That this is a family with hundreds of chemicals in it, but only 5 appeared to have the right combination of toxicity and stability and ease of manufacturing to make them worthwhile. Just want to highlight a couple of these. A234 is the Novichok agent that we believe was used to poison Sergei Skripal in 2018 in the UK. And there is a solid version of A232 called A262, which is what we think was used to poison Alexei Navalny in August of 2020 when he was flying within Russia. And so these Novichok agents were not known publicly at the time the Chemical Weapons Convention was being developed. So it was not part of that treaty at all. Since the Skripal attack, the Novichoks have been added to the Chemical Weapons Convention. So they are now explicitly listed as chemical warfare agents. It is worth noting that there's a clause within the Chemical Weapons Convention that makes it illegal to use any toxic chemical as a weapon. So even though Novichoks were not on the list of scheduled chemicals under the treaty, the use of those chemicals was still a violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And so, Russia has been in violation of that treaty basically since it was signed, because they never declared these Novichok nerve agents that they possessed. So the Skripal and Navalny actually are only the most high-profile ones that we know about. A group called Bellingcat, which does a lot of investigative journalism, has uncovered probably almost half dozen other cases where it looks like there were other Russian dissidents and other people that the Kremlin didn't like who were poisoned with Novichok as well. These are the 2 cases we have the best evidence for. Turning now to the Soviet biological weapons program, the Soviet Union developed not just the world's largest chemical weapons program, but also the world's largest biological warfare program. And this program was inherited by Russia at the end of the Soviet Union. The cooperative threat reduction program that DITRA runs, as I mentioned, spent a lot of time demilitarizing Soviet or Russian chemical and biological weapon sites. But on the bio side, they only succeeded in working with civilian institutes and facilities that have been part of the Soviet BW program, which was part of what was known as biopreparat. And those are the facilities that have been equipment and whatnot removed and the scientists employed for their purposes. But there are still large swaths of the Soviet BW program that remain intact, and not just that, but have been upgraded over time. So currently, and again, this is kind of the irony that Russia is accusing Ukraine of having 30 odd bio labs that are doing weapons work, which they're all public health labs that are doing nothing military related, and yet Russia actually has 3 top secret military microbiology facilities that were not only part of the offensive BW program under the Soviet era. Since then, they've not only been kind of maintained, they've been upgraded and expanded in certain ways. All 3 of these facilities are now sanctioned by the U.S. For developing biological weapons, and they cover kind of the waterfront of biological warfare. The facility in Sergeyev Posad specializes in virology, and we know that they do a lot of experimentation with viral hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola and Marburg. The institute in Kirov specializes in bacteria like anthrax and plague, and the facility in Yekaterinburg, which used to be known as Sverdlovsk, right, was the site of the anthrax outbreak in 1979, which Russia now claims this facility only does biodefense research, but obviously, you have to take that with a big grain of salt. It's worth noting that even though the allegations of what's going on in Ukraine are original, they're not, even though they're new, they're not original. Russia has been claiming that U.S. work with other forms of republics like Georgia, where we also helped build a BSL-3 lab for public health purposes. That's really a bioweapons project according to the Russians. And even though there have been international visits and transparency, right, Russia just continues to circulate these allegations in lots of different form. But it goes back even farther to the 1980s when the KGB planted stories in the Indian media that the CIA was responsible for creating the HIV virus in Africa and was using it as a form of biological warfare against the third world. And unfortunately, that conspiracy theory took root and is still believed again in some quarters. And so the kind of durability of this disinformation is really quite shocking. And we can expect that the kind of allegations that Russia is making now about Ukraine, again, totally unfounded and frankly, just ridiculous on many levels, right? We know these are going to persist for years and years and years. And unfortunately, that could have real repercussions on the ability to work with countries like Ukraine and others on public health and biosurveillance stuff. So that's quite kind of concerning in the long term. And the biolab allegations have become a centerpiece of the Russian propaganda in the context of the invasion of Ukraine. Right? About a quarter of all Russian disinformation has involved the biolabs, and they've been presenting this at forum like the United Nations Security Council, where they had, I think, 2 different meetings where they were putting this stuff forward. This has also been dominating Russian state media. You can see here on the right side of the screen, the red bar is the amount of content related to chemical and biological threats in Ukraine being used as the justification for the invasion of Ukraine and the quote unquote disarmament of Ukraine. And again, just Russian state media is just full of these kinds of these different allegations. That begs the question: does this work? Does Russian disinformation work or not? We don't have a ton of evidence, but there's something that is, I think, indicative of this. If you go back to the Skripal poisoning in the UK in 2018, the Russians put out like 20 different narratives about what really happened to the Skripals, and they invested again a lot of effort in state media and their Kremlin spokesmen and having sympathetic foreigners parroting their talking points. But it doesn't look like that disinformation really had a big impact in the West. So if you look at the left-hand side here, right, that there's pretty strong majorities in most European countries that the Russians were responsible for poisoning the Skripals. Only, anywhere from 6 to 10 or 11% of people thought that Russia didn't do it. So that's probably the same percentage who believe in UFOs. So there's certain people you're never going to convince. So on looking at the Western impact of this disinformation, not so successful. However, if you look at opinion polls within Russia, which admittedly have some problems because it's an authoritarian regime, but if you look there, you see that only 3% of respondents to this particular survey thought that Russia was responsible for poisoning the Skripals. And in fact, about a third of people thought that the British did it, and half the respondents said anyone could have done it. And so maybe that does indicate that Russian disinformation is much more successful with their own populace than it is with foreigners. And this quote here at the bottom from a Kremlin spokesman, I think, perfectly encapsulates the Russian strategy of what people call the fire hose of false information, right? They throw out so much allegations and accusations, many of which do not make sense, many of which contradict one another, many of which actually make the Russians look bad in different ways. It doesn't matter, because their goal at the end of the day is just to sow doubt among observers and make people just throw up hands and say, I don't know who's right or wrong. I can't keep track of all this stuff. I just give up, and making people apathetic about what's going on. And so that is not, so I think that strategy by them can be more successful. It's not a matter of convincing people about who did it, but it's making people not care because they're overwhelmed with too much information and they hear too many conflicting claims, and they just give up on trying to figure it out. And I think that is also very dangerous and very corrosive effect of their disinformation. So with that, I hope that was a good overview of the role that chemical and biological weapons have played so far in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and happy to take any questions that you have. Thanks.
Excellent, Greg. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. That was a fabulous overview of, of a complicated topic. One of the things I just wanted to ask you before Mike chimes in is the use of chlorine. So we heard a lot about that in Syria. Can you talk a little bit more about why that might be a possibility of something the Russians may use in Ukraine?
Sure. So, the odds of Russia using a classic chemical warfare agent are pretty low, because it would be pretty obvious if people start dying of sarin or Novichok that Russia is responsible. And the forensics for being able to determine, the attribution of nerve agents is pretty good. However, things like chlorine, ammonia, right? These are toxic industrial chemicals, widely available, commercially available, right, in large quantities around the world, and clearly there are going to be large quantities in Ukraine. And these don't have the same kind of forensic signatures that are associated with a chemical warfare agent. So if Russia wants to launch a false flag incident or stage an attack or do something that will make it look like chemical weapons were used and they can claim that Ukraine did it, it makes sense for them to use something like chlorine or ammonia, which will, if done properly or if made to staged properly, right, will look like it generates large casualties, but not in a way that will be very easy for people to point and say, look, this is clearly a Russian operation because look, here's ammunition that has Cyrillic writing on it. They use Novichok, which only Russia has. So I think there are risks of toxic industrial chemicals like chlorine and ammonia being used here. I think there are some lessons from the Syria experience that are relevant to Ukraine, but I think a lot of them are not, because they're just two very different situations. But happy to get into that in the Q&A.
Excellent, excellent. So with that, Mike, I'm going to turn it to you to give a short perspective on what this means overall in terms of the homeland. What are we concerned about, and what, if anything, are we doing in our actions to protect not only ourselves here, but potentially protect colleagues in Ukraine?
You bet. Thanks for having me. And it's like I was teed up for this, and Greg and I worked on our information together. We didn't, but so one of the first things I want to talk about is the disinformation campaigns. It's just we refer to it as mis, dis, or malinformation campaigns. And essentially, when we start thinking about the homeland, the mis, dis, and malinformation campaigns undermine United States policies. They increase internal political polarization and our internal divides between the left and the right and each other just across the street. They reduce effectiveness of our chem bioprotective measures in the event there is an attacker issue, because they muddy the waters. In fact, the Department of State released a statement on this on March 9th, and I think Gray had some of those slides in there that talked about that, that alleges that these things existed. The next item I want to talk on is a run on protective measures, similar to what we saw in COVID, gloves, masks, toilet paper. It could be, and we should anticipate, mis, dis, and malinformation campaigns to exacerbate this phenomenon. Distrust could be higher coming off the COVID disaster, distrust of the government, distrust of governmental leaders and experts, similar to what Fauci saw, whether you're left or right. There was a lot of distrust about the government and those positions. And if we start talking about a chem bio attack or something like that, that distrust, especially coming right off of COVID, we're going to see, and it's going to carry on through a potential event within the homeland. Let's see. The nation's critical infrastructure is vulnerable to a bio incident, particularly when we start talking about the critical workforce needed to ensure the continuity of operations. We saw this during COVID, where critical infrastructure providers had to quarantine and pay to quarantine their staff 2 weeks before they came on shift to know that they were not infected, and then they were healthy and well and could carry on what they needed to do. So one of the some of the things that we're pushing out to a lot of our partners are to connect, plan, train, and report. And so each of those broken down is to connect to information sources, official information sources, not your third cousin from Upper Michigan who wears a tinfoil hat, but official sources. And if you're an information provider, get different sets of information sources and vet that information yourself. Set up so your social media accounts to search for key terms that you can get early warning of incidents both in CONUS and out of CONUS. Ensure you're capable personally of sorting out mis, dis, and malinformation, and have a method to vet information as appropriate, rather than just like the elections, like I said a couple years ago, we just don't push that information because it grabs our emotions. We want to vet that information and make sure it's factual. You can also head to CISA.gov and do a search for Shields Up for any cyber impacts. But our Shields Up also has a lot of our protective measures and what we're pushing out there. You can head to ready.gov, which brings me to plan for the incident. So we talked about connect, now we talk about plan. Head to ready.gov and review shelter-in-place information. Make preparations for a potential incident. Understand how you and your business are vulnerable to a chem bio attack, how your supply chain is vulnerable. Predict the consequences of that and how long those consequences could last. What is your financial hit? What's your risk? What is your risk to your supply chain? What is your risk to the customers? Are there ways to get ahead of that risk? The next is to train. So ensure everyone in your organization and your family understands the shelter-in-place procedures. Make sure they understand and know where the supplies are for shelter in place. And this is very important, especially if you're out in Eastern Europe or anywhere in Europe, actually, is to understand shelter in place. Make sure they have those supplies in hand, and make sure that they know how to remain in contact with everyone until everyone is unified, whether that's your family down the street or it's business partners that are over in the Ukraine or Poland or Moldova or wherever. And lastly, report. Notify authorities if there's a suspicious incident or circumstance. Use 911, head to CISA.gov, contact the FBI's. The DHS has to see something, say something. There's a myriad of capabilities. However, if people are coming down sick or there's an anomaly, you need to call 911 and report it. Don't second guess yourself, and it better be safe than sorry. It's better to be safe than sorry. So the last word is to stay prepared and stay vigilant and vet the information you're consuming. Mis, dis, and malinformation is prevalent in America, and it's not just Russia. China likes to use it. Iran and North Korea all use it to exploit the social media phenomena, where we head to echo chambers to confirm what we already believe and confirm our biases, rather than vetting that information and discover that we might be wrong. And so when that happens, that divide increases, and we're less likely to trust official information sources. So make sure you're you're cognizant of your information bias and your confirmation bias, and get additional sources of information before you disseminate information. Without further ado, I turn it back to you, Maureen. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate that. And even though you may not recognize the relevance, the connection between the situation in Ukraine and here, I have been contacted by a major US company and also several individuals who asked me about what they could do for protection, either for their people who are currently working in Ukraine or for themselves if they're traveling in Eastern Europe. And the ready.gov site and the shelter in place site had some exceedingly useful information, kind of cartoon-esque, so you don't, lots of pictures, you don't have to be able to read a whole lot of text. And those are information sheets that we've sent into country to help people there may be prepared in case something, particularly toxic industrial chemicals, are used in those circumstances. So with that, Greg, I have a couple questions for you, and I'm going to start with the one that is the probably obvious questions. If the Russians were to use this or anything, either a biological, a chemical agent, which may not happen, or an industrial chemical, in the war setting that they're in, aren't they putting themselves at just as much risk? And if so, why would they do it?
Yeah, the why would they do it question, I think, is really important. And I think you have to look at what are potential uses and benefits, and then what are the risks to the Russians. Chemical weapons are best suited for attacking unprotected populations, usually civilians, but also military forces that aren't prepared, right? This is why Iraq was able to use chemical weapons to such effect against Iran, because Iran didn't have the kind of protective equipment they needed to defend their soldiers. And this is why Syria's used chemical weapons effectively against the rebel forces, because they don't have protection either. right, for Russia to use chemical weapons against Ukrainian soldiers who have protective gear would not be very effective. So that leaves kind of Ukrainian civilian populations as being the ones who would be most likely to be targeted with chemical weapons. But unfortunately, the reality is that Russia has lots of conventional weapons that can do lots of damage to civilians in Ukraine, as we've seen, demonstrated quite graphically and horribly. And so, the value for Russia to escalate to using chemical weapons to go after civilian populations militarily doesn't. I don't think there's real value there. There's a psychological impact, and the chemical weapons are particularly terrifying and horrifying, and so there might be some value viewed from that perspective. But then you then look, okay, what are the costs and risks to the Russians? On the one hand, a chemical weapon is still a weapon of mass destruction, and so that would be a major escalation of the conflict, and is the kind of thing that would be most likely to bring in a much more robust NATO involvement in the war, even beyond where it is now. And given how quickly NATO and EU kind of rallied around Ukraine and how strong the sanctions have been and how much military support Ukraine's already received, the Russians would have to expect that level of support and unification to only increase in the event of chemical weapons being used, right next door to NATO. And as we've seen in, Russian military operations so far, they've been logistically challenged, to say the least. And so if I am the Russian general staff, right, I would not have a lot of confidence that I could conduct a complex chemical weapons attack and not screw it up one way or another. And then if these weapons are actually used, right, then Russian forces would have to be protected against the potential contaminated territory, or if the wind changes and they're exposed to it. So that just adds a whole other level of logistical difficulties to Russia that I don't think their military can handle now, right? They can barely keep their tires inflated and their trucks moving. So throwing in chemical weapons to the mix, I think, would just be a nightmare for Russian logistical planners. Right, there are ways around that, or if they rely on kind of long-range standoff delivery with missiles or bombers, right, you would avoid that logistical problem. But then that'd be a very obvious Russian chemical attack with an aircraft or a missile, and with lots of debris and evidence of Russian culpability, which again would then risk escalation in ways I think that they do not want. So this is a set of reasons why I think the threat of Russia using chemical weapons kind of in that way directly against Ukraine is very, very low, but can't rule out they might find a way to stage an event or have a false flag incident in a much more controlled way that they could then use to rally public support at home. And and that's why I think there were a number of warnings from various governments around this, and I think that is still it's still a concern. And the one thing I would also just highlight here is I've been a little I think there's been too much alarmist talk about Russian use of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. I think it's been exaggerated, and it actually plays into Putin's propaganda, right? Because it's something else to be afraid of the Russians that they might do, and therefore we shouldn't push, we shouldn't support Ukraine as much as we can, and it kind of helps Putin counteract the weaknesses that have been demonstrated in the Russian military and their conventional military operations. So this is why I don't like people who are going on and on and on about Russian tactical nuclear weapons and chemical weapons and biological weapons, in public, because I think that actually contributes to the Russian narrative in a way that distracts from the real issue, which is, Russia is using lots of nasty conventional weapons to cause lots of damage to Ukraine and kill innocent civilians, and that's what we need to be focused on at this point.
Thank you. That is really helpful information, and I especially appreciate that last point that let's not play into his hands by repeating the fear factor and elevating the fear factor. There's been a lot of talk, Greg, in recent years about the threat of synthetic biology being used as a tool to target either individuals or specific groups. is this something that is real, and is it something that can be used on the battlefield? And has this occurred, or is this still in the realm of science fiction?
Yes, the idea of ethnic bioweapons has been around for a long time, and it's still science fiction, but there are some developments in certain areas that are creating the foundation for potential misuse down the line. So there has been this explosion in population genomics research, right, enabled by sequencing being very cheap and be able to get complete human genome sequences at scale, and then having the computing power to analyze that and to identify similarities and differences within ethnic groups, between ethnic groups. A lot of this is for personalized medicine reasons, but there's just a vast quantity now of information we have on the genetic makeup of individuals from all over the world and also different ethnic groups. So the idea that you could find a marker that is unique to a particular ethnic group is becoming more plausible, right? It would still be incredibly difficult because humans are our genetic similarities just far outweigh our genetic differences. So finding that difference would be unique to one group and not anyone else, right, would be extremely hard. But separately, because of genome editing, gene therapy, development of viral vectors, right, there are now also increasingly potential delivery vehicles that if you had a specific genetic marker that you wanted to target, that you have a way to do that. And right, and this is the promise of genome editing is that thanks to CRISPR, right, you can go to a very specific part of a gene and latch onto it and make insertions, deletions, or whatnot. So in theory, the combination of several of these different kind of biotech developments could be disturbing, but we're so far from that being the case now, right? We're still, the era of personalized medicine is still very nascent, right? We can still barely use the insights we have to help, cure diseases. So the idea that we're going to be able to take that limited knowledge and turn around and turn it an ethnically targeted bioweapon, which the Russians have talked about publicly as being something they're worried about, it's just not, it's not feasible. And I think that's, again, part of this, the part of why the Russian disinformation is just, I don't want, well, I mean, it's silly. I don't want to kind of trivialize it because it is damaging, but it is, it's just not based in modern, current science. There's a lot of, paranoia and fantasy involved with the way that Russia thinks this stuff is being developed at this point.
Excellent. Thank you, Greg. I appreciate that. So I'm going to close out. And Mike, I think you did part of this in your response, but I'm going to ask you both to close with a view towards how do we watch this situation moving forward? What should we be paying attention to? I mean, we talked about the misinformation, the malinformation, all of these things. So for our community, how do we view it? Where do we get our news? And what can we actively do to stay informed and yet not continue to generate the fear? And where would you seek that information moving forward? So Mike, I'll start with you, and then Greg, I'll give you the last word.
Great, thank you. I think the biggest thing is to, one, get your news from multiple sources. When we start going to echo chambers and we start going to places that we know we're going to hear something that proves us right, we tend to take our analytical capabilities that differentiate humans from the rest of the the animal kingdom. We miss that opportunity to think for ourselves. And so if I go to 3 or 4 different news sites about the same type of article or the same type of incident, I can start to make my own ideas about these things. Additionally, it's much less likely that the disinformation and misinformation and malinformation campaigns have hit all the major news sites like BBC, like Reuters, like Fox, like CNN, like MSNBC, et cetera. there's a lot of independent think tanks out there as well that have a lot of great information that appears to be very neutral and partisan, and it appears to be very factual, and they back it up with additional sites. So take a moment, take the extra time to be analytical, to do the extra work rather than going to a single site, going, that's got to be true, and pushing it forward. And that's the same whether we're talking about a chem bio attack in the Ukraine. It's the same whether we're talking about chem bio attack stateside, or we're talking about elections, or we're talking about a raise in taxes to fund the roundabout down the hill. It doesn't matter. We need to make sure we're sourcing our information from multiple sites, and we're verifying their raw material. We want to look at the references. We want to look at what makes them think that. So we have to get to the why of these things, and then understand why we believe that as well. And that takes a little bit extra time, but there's an amazing amount of freedom when we start thinking for ourselves.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that note. Greg.
I mean, it's want to echo everything Mike said in terms of being careful where you're getting your information from and how you screen it. I've put into the chat the website for a newsletter that my program puts out every week called the Pandora Report. And we've been covering this issue since the beginning. And so it's a good resource if you want to stay up to date on biodefense and global health security issues. We do news analysis about these issues across the board. And one of the things that I try and do, personally, is I don't forward or like or retweet the Russian disinformation. I will push the people debunking the disinformation, right? And I think that's important. If you want to, I do, I go to the Russian military, website. I look at the materials. I'm not going to then share that and distribute that because I don't think it helps to, do the Russians' job for them by spreading their disinformation. But I think it is worthwhile to help those who are debunking this and pushing back against this misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and help them give them platforms and amplify their voices. And I think that's a very useful thing that we can do. That's pretty easy.
That's excellent information, Greg. And for the NSFers, yes, I am assembling a resource page with lots of information that we've acquired from our speakers and from other sources that you'll be able to link to. We just haven't been able to get it organized and up on our website yet, but we intend to do that by the end of this week. So please stay tuned. We'll be sending out an announcement on that. Thank you both for speaking to us. Greg, thank you for that very insightful walk through the situation on CBW in Ukraine. It really helps us stay aware. There are lots of facets to this war, and we need to stay apprised of all of them. NSFers, please plan on joining us for our program on the interaction between Russia and China vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine. That program will be the 14th of April, and an announcement should be going out by Friday of this week. So with that, thank you both for your time. Thank you, NSFers, for your time. And please stay safe, and we will see you again in a couple of weeks.